All right, guys, welcome to the first lecture for AP European History that we're going to do together. And what we're going to cover today is the first reading that you guys did. And I believe we started on around page 322, and I asked you to read to page 338. And what we're going to look at together today are really the two factors that brought the Middle Ages kind of grinding to a halt, according to most historians. And those two factors were the Black Death or the Black Plague and the 100 Years' War. So we're going to look at those two things just briefly. And most of this you guys have already seen in the reading, so we won't have to spend too much time on it. I'll try to go pretty quickly so that we can get through these. If the video does stop, there'll be a second part, so pull it up. These things are limited to 10 minutes. All right, so the first section of the reading was called Prelude to Disaster. Essentially what they're talking about is some environmental factors that lead to the Black Death having maybe a bigger impact than it would have. Beginning in the first decade of the 14th century, so we're looking at that first 10 or so years of the 1300s, we see a really dramatic shift in the weather. Historians have called that a Little Ice Age, and it lasts for about 150 years. We see temperatures drop. We see wet weather that's going to have a bad effect on crops like wheat. And because of these poor harvests, there's going to be a famine that occurs in England and other parts of Europe, which lasts for a pretty long time, for 7 years, in fact, from 1315 to 1322. Of course, with less food, people are, literally starving. So they're not going to be nearly as productive. Therefore, they're not going to produce as much food. It's a pretty vicious downward spiral, and that continues and continues. Meanwhile, as things like wheat get harder to come by, the prices of those grains increase. So not only is there less grain to be had, but it also costs more. This cycle of bad harvest is going to lead to illness, as people are going to be weak, they're not eating right, they're going to be malnourished, and of course more susceptible to disease. As a social consequence of this turn in the weather, we see a lot more people wandering throughout Europe, essentially abandoning historic traditional family homesteads, looking for opportunity. International trade, as we're going to see, is going to have widespread repercussions as disease is going to travel very quickly. There really aren't a lot of solutions for this. Kings endeavor to buy grain. The problem is that the weather change affects most of Europe, especially Northern Europe. And even if kings wanted to buy grain, there's really none to buy. So not a lot of solutions here, and people are going to start looking for people to blame it on and for scapegoats. And we're going to see that in Europe time and time again. So the Black Plague or the Black Death or the bubonic plague, whichever you prefer, is kind of questionable in its origins. It had been reported years earlier as far east as China, and maybe that was some of the first reports of it. Where it came from in terms of arriving in Western Europe, we know it came by ship, most likely entered through Italy, at least according to the historical record when it's first reported. You see here on the slide, it says questionable origins. It talks about the city of Kaffa. Apparently the Mongols were throwing victims of the plague's bodies over the walls of the city as they tried to seize the city. They were throwing plague victims' bodies over the wall using catapults. So people there were infected. As ships crossed and trade had progressed, the disease just spread. And you can see here on the map, starting here as early as 1347. Here's some of the first places that the ships land, and then it just spreads and spreads and spreads from there. And it takes, in some cases years, but it makes it all the way to England by 1348. So the plague has arrived. The vector for this disease is the Oriental rat flea, and rats and other vermin were very common on ships. The fleas would get the plague, from the host, which were the rats, and then they would spread it to people. Unfortunately, in the Middle Ages, even the most upscale people were oftentimes infested with fleas. It was just not a very hygienic society. These dirty cities were perfect hosts, and the plague itself was pneumonic in that it can be spread not only from flea bites but also from coughing, sneezing, it was airborne. So it was a very bad situation. The classic symptom of the plague is the buba, which is that black sort of knot that you'll often see from the illustrations of the time. And on these images, you can see them pretty well. And this is unfortunately a modern day version or modern day picture of an actual victim of the plague. If you don't know, the plague has not been eradicated, it is dormant. So if you don't want to sleep well tonight, think about the idea that that could come roaring back. And of course, this is the infamous image of the plague doctor. And they really had no idea how to avoid this illness, and no real medical treatment for it either. So the questions about the causes throughout Europe, we start to see pogroms against Jewish people. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, the Jewish people in Europe, from time immemorial, back to the time of Christ, and the centuries that followed that, had oftentimes been scapegoated for issues that came up in countries where they were the minority. In the city of Strasbourg, 16,000 Jews were murdered, some burned alive because they were blamed for spreading the plague. And a lot of that was out of ignorance and suspicion. When there's a terrible problem that's going on and society doesn't know how to fix that problem, sometimes it's very easy to blame a group of people who are in the minority. And we're going to see that time and again, all the way really through 1945 in Europe. I mean, it's a recurring theme that we're going to see. One of the most famous chroniclers of the disease, one of the people that really produced one of the best primary sources, was a guy named Boccaccio. It's an Italian writer who wrote a work called the Decameron. Essentially, it's a frame story book. It's set in a villa in Italy where the people are telling stories, and they've left and they're out in the countryside and trying to basically wait out the plague. So we know a lot about the disease from that story as it was produced during that time. Hospitals weren't much help here. The only thing that really helped was quarantine, and people that had enough money or opportunity to get away from cities and out into the countryside had a much better chance of survival, as they weren't as likely to be infected. That being said, the mortality rates were extremely high. And nobody knows the exact numbers, of course, but in England we saw maybe 1.4 million deaths out of a population of 4.2 million people, and in Europe as a whole, anywhere from 19 to 38 million deaths, and that would include 25% upwards to 50% of the population. So I mean, it's really, really hard to imagine, and it's really hard to understate the impact of this disease. But it's going to wind up having a massive effect on European society as a whole that we're going to see. The clergy suffer a high death rate. Oftentimes, they were the ones that were administering care. This is going to destabilize the church to a degree that we haven't seen before. Other factors come into play here as well that we'll discuss. The authors point out that at the time, Europe's economy could not sustain the population. So if you wanted to see like a bright side of this, Europe's overpopulation problem was definitely corrected. And after the plague, there is a new kind of upward mobility. There's more opportunity. Inflation begins. We do see a fall in production, but you also see a rise in prices. Here's the kicker. There are less people than to work. So workers demand and get higher wages, and this means peasants to a large degree. There is no longer an overabundance of peasants to do the work. So for peasants, in some ways, the ones that survived this plague and this disease, they came out, on the other side of it with some benefits. They could demand more pay. They had more mobility, and there were efforts to stop them. One law called the Statute of Laborers tried to set wages back to pre-plague prices, but the realities of the market and the economy never allowed for that. Increased wages mean higher standards of living. Unfortunately, again, the price of slaves rises sharply in the Mediterranean, and we do see some pretty impactful psychological effects on Europe as well. If you can imagine, watching 50% of the people around you die, including family members and children and whoever else was dear to you, this really creates a very pessimistic worldview. Religious extremists like the flagellants that you may have read about, who essentially were trying anything they could upwards of self-mutilation to avoid getting this disease. The idea was that if you punished yourself, and recognize